Thanks, Carrie Lynn. Thanks for having me on the program, and thanks everybody for showing up. This is super excited. I'm happy to be the opening match, and happy WrestleMania, everyone. Okay, so this paper is part of a larger work that I'm developing, which is an ontology of pro wrestling. That is an analysis of what it is and how it fits into the rest of the world from an analytic philosophy perspective. So rather than arguing here for the claim that pro wrestling is a form of art, that is that it is best understood by analogy to other phenomena generally considered to be art rather than other sorts of things, I'm just going to assume that you're on board with that idea, that this audience will be. I also followed the philosopher John Dewey in taking the difference between art and entertainment mostly to be that the former, that art is an honorific. It denotes a kind of status, and that if people began to consider more of their so-called entertainment as art, they would demand more of it, and it would all likely be a lot better on the whole. I take it, I take it for granted again that the present audience is sympathetic to at least some wrestling deserving the honorific of art, and will go on to explain what I take to be the unique, or at least distinctive features of wrestling as an art form, both what it has in common with other art media and what sets it apart. I will not here attempt to provide a complete set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be pro wrestling, conditions that would mark out all and only instances of pro wrestling. But again, I will detail a few of the features that I think are distinctive of pro wrestling and that make it interesting and worthy of the attention of philosophers and art critics. So there are three things epistemological. It's what Lowry was earlier calling the liminal space between fantasy and reality. It has to do with, as I say it, the relation between appearance and reality with which wrestling consistently plays. The epistemic position of the consumers of pro wrestling is far from simple. Besides the fact that there are some people who continue to believe that wrestling matches are legitimate contests, even so-called smart fans who know it's a show may still have some doubts about the nature of some of what they perceive in front of them. To begin with, there's the question of how much particular wrestling moves hurt. Wrestling moves, which include slams, throws, or suplexes, leaping attacks, and submission holds, are designed to look like they are causing high levels of pain and damage to the wrestlers receiving them, while in reality, their harmful effects are usually far less than they let on. Nevertheless, when perfectly performed, they can still be painful, and small mistakes in timing or execution can result in genuinely devastating or even fatal injuries. For this reason, it is often difficult for a viewer to know whether an injury is legitimate or feigned. Wrestling purveyors will even stage storyline injuries that are made to look like legitimate injuries that have been recently seen by the audience to make them more believable. In general, the purveyors of pro wrestling frequently intentionally undermine viewers' sense of what is part of the show and what is not. For instance, in 1996, prominent WWF stars Scott Hall and Kevin Nash appeared on WCW television, seemingly invading the rival company in the eyes of some fans who didn't know that behind the scenes they had actually left WWF and signed with WCW. What is really going on both on camera and behind the scenes is opaque at every level. In most cases, fans can be fairly sure that what happens on screen is merely part of the show, but they can still speculate about what machinations behind the scenes produce the story that unfolds in front of them. Did Ricochet, for instance, get beaten so quickly by Brock Lesnar and then Riddick Moss because Vince McMahon has decided that he doesn't have what it takes to be a star? The wrestling dirt sheets would have you believe so, but how reliable are they? How often are the leaks to such journalists intentional misdirection from the wrestling companies themselves? Sometimes the show spills over into reality, as when then Nancy Sullivan left her husband Kevin and married Chris Benoit after Kevin wrote that very event into a storyline, leading to Benoit and Sullivan duking it out somewhat for real within their predetermined matches. This has horrifying implications, of course, given what happened to the Benoit family years later. Even once they are part of the show, wrestling performers are generally only told as much information as they need to do their jobs. So much of the inner workings is opaque even to them. Only the person completely in charge of creative, such as Vince McMahon himself, knows everything that's going on. Though even then, in some cases, such as Brian Pillman's deception of Eric Bischoff, even the booker gets worked. Wrestling is often compared to soap opera, Greek tragedy, daytime talk shows such as Jerry Springer and Maury Povich, and comic books due to its narrative structure and or subject matter. However, what is often overlooked, such as in the South Park WTF episode about wrestling, is the wrestling itself. Contemporary audiences are so used to seeing wrestling on television that they underappreciate that it is essentially a live performance. Wrestling television shows represent what happens in the arena to the viewer at home, ensconcing it in an elaborate package that includes backstage vignettes, pre-taped video packages, and advertisements. These are often shown to the live crowd as well, but are designed principally for the TV viewer, as evidenced by the fact that untelevised house shows rarely include them. There is so much of this non-wrestling content on weekly WWE television shows that it is easy for casual viewers to forget that the actual wrestling is what takes place in front of the crowd, usually inside a ring. While everything else is part of the presentation of wrestling, wrestling can and did for much of its history take place without it. So the second distinctive element I want to draw attention to concerns the actual in-ring wrestling itself. Some may object to call wrestling an art form because, unlike other narrative forms such as theater, cinema, and literature, its subject matter may be seen as somewhat limited. It can no doubt be dramatic, tragic, or comic, include elements of sci-fi, horror, fantasy, or noir, and even have an absurdist or self-referential character. But no matter what, it is always principally about the competition between the wrestlers, who wins and who loses. Whatever narrative is built around the combatants, what matters fundamentally is the match and the outcome of that match. This is the payoff for whatever storyline has been developed. To understand this and to see how, despite these parameters, wrestling still deserves the honorific of art, one must think of the elements of a wrestling match not just as parts of a specific story, the story of the wrestlers competing against one another in the ring, but as formal elements that are common to storytelling in general and symbolize an abstract relationship between the characters. Like other narrative forms, the typical wrestling match has a kind of three-act structure: the babyface shine, the heel cutoff leading into the heat, and then the babyface comeback into the finish. These stages are clearly analogous to the presentation of the protagonist, introduction of dramatic tension, and resolution common to all types of narrative. Of course, some more contemporary and experimental matches vary or entirely eschew this formula, as do some kinds of theater, literature, and film, but the vast majority of cases in all those art forms still hold closely to that structure. Whatever larger narrative is built around the wrestling match, generally involving a conflict between the desires of the participants, the match itself tells the entire story of that conflict through the symbolism of wrestling moves. The wrestler pinning their opponent to the mat for a three count, being counted out, being disqualified, or submitting, and the sequence of events that leads to that finish symbolically represents the larger dynamic between those characters. For example, that one is jealous of the other's superior skills, that both respect one another, that one, despite being outmatched in conventional virtues, is cunningly able to overtake the other in status, etc. In this way, the pro wrestling match is itself a metaphor for life, adaptable to myriad relations between individuals, albeit construed essentially in terms of power relations. Hence, one might think wrestling has a generally Nietzschean conception of reality, which has also been claimed of superhero comic books. Now, the foregoing has mostly been about what wrestling has in common with other art forms, such that it can be counted among them. But one thing I take to be unique to wrestling, though it perhaps has a close cousin in interpretive dance, is the physical language with which its stories are told. Each wrestling maneuver does, or at least should, mean something to the audience. To begin with, there is a set of basic wrestling moves, mostly developed by the Goldust trio of the 30s, who had much to do with the compositional tropes of modern wrestling, and each has its own distinct meaning. Underlying these moves is the actual catch-as-catch-can and Greco-Roman wrestling, which is more primitive in its connotations of dominance and submission, capture and escape. But with the Goldust trio and those who followed them, movements were introduced that have more discrete significance. The body slam is the paradigmatic power maneuver. One wrestler lifts the other over their head and slams them to the mat, demonstrating their dominance vis-a-vis raw physical strength. The drop kick is the move of the high-flying daredevil, who risks their own body to defeat their opponent by jumping into the air and kicking them with both feet, then crashing to the mat themselves. The arm drag, perhaps the most essential move to Mexican lucha libre, is a move of finesse. Like a judo or aikido practitioner, a wrestler employs an arm drag by using their opponent's momentum against them, throwing them over their shoulder into a supine position. The sleeper hold is utilized by cerebral or technical wrestlers who know that if they wrap their arms around their opponent's neck and apply pressure to just the right spots, they can subdue them. The pile driver conveys ruthlessness. The wrestler who uses it cares not for their opponent's welfare, willing to cripple them or kill them for the victory. The foreign object is the weapon of the true heel, who is willing to break the rules in order to win. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but most wrestling moves are variations or developments on the ones I've cataloged here. Other moves have historical significance to the fans. Anyone who uses the sharpshooter submission holds evokes in the audience, especially Canadian ones, memories of Bret Hart, including the shocking, even traumatic Montreal Screwjob incident. A skillful wrestler understands these moves and what they are likely to mean to a particular crowd. This brings me to the third distinctive element of wrestling as art, which is the role of the audience. Almost all art is produced for an audience, but arguably only in pro wrestling is the audience a constitutive part of the art object. For this part of the discussion, I lean on the philosopher of music, Theodore Graysick, who in his book Rhythm and Noise, An Aesthetics of Rock, understands what is distinctive about a particular art form to be its primary object of critical attention, or locus of critical scrutiny. I'll call it the LCS from here. The main aspect of the art form that one considers when evaluating it aesthetically. He argues on this basis that rock music is a distinct art form from jazz, which itself was distinct from classical music. For the latter, classical music, the LCS was the score. When we critically evaluate Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, for instance, we don't consider a particular performance or recording of it, but the score that Beethoven composed. One might evaluate an individual performance, but this is secondary to consideration of the score, which is thought of as the work of this kind of art. With jazz, this shifts to the individual live performance, and with rock, it is the record album, the recording that is the LCS. A critical evaluation of a pro wrestling match is incomplete without consideration of the actions of the crowd. I don't want to claim that the crowd is by itself the LCS of wrestling, but it is a constitutive part of it. A concert, play, or film might be excellent even if the audience hates it or if there is no audience at all. But there is no pro wrestling without a crowd, because the crowd isn't just an audience. They are also the very medium with which the wrestlers work. One does not so much wrestle for an audience as one wrestles the audience. This is, of course, rooted in pro wrestling's carnival history. It has evolved into an artful con artistry in which fans willingly and eagerly participate, while, if attentive, they simultaneously observe and critique. Wrestlers perform by moving their bodies, but they do so in order to manipulate the crowd in various ways, as a painter manipulates paint or a musician manipulates sound. To extend the latter analogy, one might watch a jazz guitarist play a solo concert with the sound off and remark at their skill at playing their instrument merely by watching their fingers. But one cannot actually be evaluating the music without hearing the sound. Analogously, one can critique the movements of wrestlers, but without the crowd response, one is not actually critiquing an instance of pro wrestling. Our current situation is evidence for this. The recent crowdless WWE broadcasts failed to realize the aesthetic effect of wrestling because without the crowd, the wrestlers' actions become meaningless. And so I fear this weekend's WrestleMania will be a dreadfully tedious affair. Even the evaluation of the classical score by someone who merely reads it requires the evaluator to at least imagine mentally how it would sound if played. We might imagine how the crowd would have responded in WrestleMania, but the aesthetic effect, as with reading a classical score versus hearing it played, would be relatively thin. A babyface makes their comeback because of the swell of support from the onlookers. The fact that they are cheering is part of the story of the match. This is why the most interesting matches in wrestling history have involved extreme, unusual, or complex crowd reactions. The Hart-Austin double turn, Undertaker's WrestleMania loss to Brock Lesnar, and John Cena versus Rob Van Dam at ECW One Night Stand 2006 immediately come to mind. Exceptions, such as the empty arena match between The Rock and Mankind in 1999, prove the rule. Like John Cage's 433 or Malovich's White on White, they draw our attention to what is absent. Matt Hardy's Ultimate Deletion videos and similar things are interesting pieces of cinema which involve pro wrestling as subject matter and are parts of the larger wrestling TV show narrative, but they are more akin to the matches depicted in wrestling movies, such as The Wrestler, No Holds Barred, or Nacho Libre, than they are to paradigmatic instances of pro wrestling. On the other hand, Invisible Man versus Invisible Stan from last year's Joey Janela's Spring Break is pro wrestling, even though it didn't even have actual wrestlers in it. But the crowd played their role to perfection to make the whole thing work. Sitting in an actual live wrestling crowd, one simultaneously plays three roles: audience member, manipulated material, and performer, as the wrestlers often refer to the crowd as if it was itself a character in the story. Is this unique to pro wrestling? Well, something similar happens in other art forms. In wrestling, no matter how well executed the moves are, if the crowd doesn't react to a wrestling match, it cannot be a good match. Stand-up comedy is similar. A comedian bombs if their audience doesn't laugh. But does that entail that their set wasn't funny? Can a comedy album where you can't hear the audience have the intended aesthetic effect? Performance art may offer another instructive comparison. Does Duchamp's fountain, which I take to be a performative piece, or a Banksy stunt, only work as a piece of art if the art world responds with shock, horror, and confusion? One might think of pro wrestling and stand-up as two species of the genus performance art. Andy Kaufman engaged in both, and his particular approach in both areas seems best characterized as a kind of performance art. In wrestling, some of the most interesting moments are when segments of the crowd are at odds with one another. Unlike primed and directed TV studio audiences, they are encouraged to respond spontaneously. This might make wrestling more like the work of Duchamp and Marina Abramovich, and less like comedians who at least intend for and expect the whole audience to laugh. Hecklers are generally taken as disturbances of the show, though in wrestling too, a largely recalcitrant audience can also entail an aesthetic failure, as in Lesnar versus Goldberg from WrestleMania 20. The best wrestlers can navigate inhospitable terrains in order to produce a successful work, however. In at least one instance, one of my favorites, Daniel Bryan versus Brock Lesnar at Survivor Series 2018, Bryan was able to play with the crowd's expectations so that at one point they became hostile to the match, not to either of the participants, thinking it would be a disappointing squash. And then just when they were at the depths of despair and dejection, he subverted those expectations by turning it into a spirited contest. If wrestling is to further develop and prove itself worthy of the art honorific, I believe it will have to produce more examples of this kind of match, where we are directed to watch and listen to the crowd as much as to what happens in the squared circle. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Ben. There's been a lot of discussion going on in the chat.
Okay.
So we probably can't get to all that here, but a lot of people have been bringing up the empty matches and things. And I would encourage you to talk about that as we move forward here. And one of the things that also has come up is this idea of the author is dead and that concept and how that applies to professional wrestling. When we think of wrestling as an art form, how do you have more of the artistic license coming from the fans or from the wrestlers? So there's a lot of things to bring up here, and we only have 2 minutes in this section. But I think one thing that they would like to hear more about is, are those empty arena matches? And do you think that, have you seen the AEW versus the WWE? And do you think that they're handling the artistic aspect of those in any particular way?
Yeah, I saw a little bit of the AEW stuff. I saw the first week, and I thought it was good that they had like the wrestlers as audience. Of course, there's still an audience, right? There's still us watching on TV. So I think in order for it to be pro wrestling at all, there's got to at least be someone watching who doesn't know the finish. Otherwise, it's just practice. But yeah, we're going to, I guess, especially the longer this goes on, we're going to see these variations on wrestling that involve no audience, or I really think I said before we started recording that I thought the on-location matches are probably going to be the most interesting ones of WrestleMania. I think what we're seeing is sort of a new art form develop that is this cinematic presentation of wrestling. It's to me, it's not the same thing as what you get in an arena with a crowd, but it's sort of a offshoot of it in a certain way, which could still be really cool. I know that there are other empty arena matches besides the Mankind Rock one. I watched just recently, it was Terry Funk, I think. Terry Funk and Jerry Lawler, I think, which was interesting as well. But yeah, I don't know. I'm interested to see how they start playing with this stuff. Definitely having the hard cam facing the entranceway and not the empty seats was a really good move by AEW. I think having the wrestlers in the audience helped a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I've been watching NXT, which is my habit. My weekly wrestling habit has been for a while now. And I just, it's sad. I'm not getting, I don't care about what's happening in the ring the way that I do when there's a live audience.